affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching The Gist. An extremely warm welcome to all our viewers who are joining us live, and a welcome to those viewers who will pick up this stream later on our YouTube channel. We're also welcoming for the first time to our platform Olga Tokariuk. She's a journalist, a disinformation researcher, and freelance correspondent with FA in Kyiv, in Ukraine. Olga, спасибо за ваше время, and thank you so much for joining us on StratNews Global.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is ours. Let me also introduce from Berlin is Sergej Sumlenny. He's an expert on Eastern Europe. Sergej, здравствуйте, добрый вечер. It's almost evening in Berlin, I think. Thank you for your time as well.
Good evening, and great greetings from Berlin, where we have got our new government today. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Pleasure is ours. You just wanted to discuss the situation that has been, escalating or brewing for weeks now on the Russian-Ukrainian border, and the news peg is the Biden-Putin video call, a virtual meet. So before I get your comments and opinions and expert analysis, let me just play out a soundbite of the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He was talking about the White House statement post that video call between President Vladimir Putin and President Joe Biden.
Biden was direct and straightforward with President Putin, as he always is. He reiterated America's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He told President Putin directly that if Russia further invades Ukraine, the United States and our European allies would respond with strong economic measures. We would provide additional defensive materiel to the Ukrainians above and beyond that which we are already providing. And we would fortify our NATO allies on the eastern flank with additional capabilities in response to such an escalation. He also told President Putin there's another option: de-escalation and diplomacy.
That's one part of the beginning of the statement that Jake Sullivan was reading out. We'll get to some other issues as well. Olga, just for our viewers who may not really be, know the nuances of the situation, if you could summarize, in your opinion, what's really happening at the Russian-Ukrainian border.
Well, according to different estimates, there are between 90,000 and 115,000 Russian troops stationed now at the Ukrainian border, and there is also Russian military equipment such as helicopters, artillery systems, tanks, and other equipment. All this led Western intelligence agencies to believe that Russia might be preparing a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We have to note here that actually the war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it has been going on for 7 years. It started in 2014, and every week Ukrainian soldiers are dying at the front line defending Ukraine. However, what is discussed now and what is the threat now, that it might be a much bigger scale invasion, that it might come from various directions, that Russians might want to seize more Ukrainian territory, or in Donbass, or even beyond that, maybe seizing eastern Ukraine, the whole of eastern Ukraine, or some ports on the Black and Azov Sea, which have strategic importance. So there are different scenarios. Nobody knows what's going to happen and what's on Putin's mind. But definitely there is a high alert and a big level of threat. And that's why the Western partners of Ukraine have also been engaged. And there were these talks between Biden and Putin in order to de-escalate the situation, and also to send a strong signal to Moscow that Western partners will not abandon Ukraine.
Right. Sergej, you've been at least tweeting a lot, and even your work speaks a lot about your views. The Russian point of view is that it's because of US and NATO expansion on the eastern flank. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, that's typical Russian point of view, or official point of view, which they use to spread in Europe and in the world, that they feel threatened because of NATO expansion. I can tell you frankly that it is pure fantasy and pure propaganda. First, Russia doesn't have today a longer border, land border to NATO country than the US had during the Soviet time. There were the borders to Norwegia and to the US and to Turkey during the Soviet time. Now they have like borders to Baltic states, but no border to Turkey anymore. So the length of the border itself is the same. Second, there were no attempts of NATO to invade their neighbors, to annex their territories, or to do any hostile acts towards Russia. Or towards Moscow. The only reason why Baltic states wanted to be NATO members and are NATO members, because Moscow has twice occupied them within the 20th century. And still on Russian official state TV, you can see experts who call for invasion to Baltics. After all, Russia was always invited to NATO Coordination Council during Yeltsin time. Russia left it after NATO helped on Balkans. Russia was always invited to all talks, and now what Russia does, Russia closes the NATO embassy in Moscow. Russia expels NATO diplomats. Russia expels representatives of NATO, and clearly threats NATO countries with an invasion. That's why, of course, Ukraine or Georgia or other countries strive for NATO, because they see that it is their only chance to survive. As having a highly aggressive NATO nuclear-capable neighbor who is annexing a neighbor's territory, you cannot stand alone as a small nation, and only NATO can provide the necessary security. That's all.
Right. Olga, Jake Sullivan was also asked a specific question on, whether President Putin had put any pressure on the US in terms of NATO, in terms of Ukraine. I just want to go to that part of his briefing that he gave at the White House, Jake Sullivan, on NATO.
Did President Putin ask for President Biden to commit to not allow NATO or Ukraine to join NATO? And did President Biden make any kinds of concessions, such as a reduced U.S. presence or any commitment on NATO and Ukraine's membership?
I'm not going to characterize President Putin's side of the conversation or go into details in terms of what they discussed, because I think they need to have that space to be able to have robust exchange. But I will tell you clearly and directly, he made no such commitments or concessions. He stands by the proposition that countries should be able to freely choose who they associate with.
Olga, from what you've heard, both from the White House and from the Kremlin and officials on both sides, what do you make of the call, and has it managed to reduce the tension?
Well, we definitely hope, but the tensions can only be reduced when Russia withdraws its troops and its military equipment from the Ukrainian border. And so far, we have seen no signals from the Kremlin that they are willing to do so. Well, actually, I think what Russia is trying to achieve with this amassment of troops at the Ukraine's border, it's one, a seat at the negotiating table with the West, because, well, Russia escalates and then it creates crisis situations, and then it somehow is invited to solve this crisis. But the current crisis is entirely of Russia's making, because Ukraine has not done any provocative steps. It didn't make any offensive moves towards recapturing territories that has been occupied by Russia, despite what the Russian propaganda says. So this is a crisis entirely of Russia's making, and having it is one way for Russia to be invited to the negotiation table with the big powers, with the US, to have a debate. And another thing why Russia is doing that is because while it tries to influence Ukraine's orientation, Russia cannot come to terms with the fact that Ukraine is a democracy and that it is moving towards Western standard of democracy. Because if we look at the political systems in Russia and in Ukraine, and also the situation with human rights, we will see that these are completely two different stories. Ukraine is a country that has free elections, that has freedom of speech, that has where its citizens have an ability to protest peacefully, and where the opposition can work normally without risking being imprisoned or poisoned. All these things that are unimaginable in Putin's Russia. And that's why I think this is the main reason, the main motivation of Russia's pressure on Ukraine. It tries to drag Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence and to stop its integration with the Euro-Atlantic structures.
Sergej, in terms of the White House readout statement, what we've heard of the warnings that have been given in terms of serious economic consequences, how do you see them affecting Russia's behavior?
I would say that the promises that we currently hear from the White House are, from my point of view, pretty weak, and they can be seen in Kremlin as a sign of unwillingness to stay for the allies and neighbors in Europe. Guys, look what we have currently. We have since 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 30 years, we have a constant decline of US military presence in Europe. We had, on the top of Cold War, we had over 400,000 US troops in Europe. Now we have like 10 times less. And the process of removal of US troops from Europe, which started under Trump, is continued under Biden. That is what is happening. The US is just pulling back out of the neighbors and allies. That is the problem. Now what we have is the sanctions. Biden has set a deal with Merkel half a year ago regarding the gas pipeline, Russian gas pipeline Nord Stream, which actually gives Putin a lot of power, a lot of chances to press on both Germany and Ukraine. And they said, okay, like it's like purely economic business. We will not intimidate. And what now has been told, obviously, during the Biden-Putin talks, is not that Putin must pull his troops back or Nord Stream will be shut down. No, Biden just told him what we knew. What we know is that they will think about cutting down Nord Stream 2 if Putin escalates further in Ukraine. So currently, Putin, I completely agree to Olga what she said. Like Putin always escalates, brings the situation, brings the crisis to the next level, and then to bring the situation down to the previous level, he wants to get some concessions, and that is what actually effectively is win situation for Putin. He did nothing to improve the situation in Ukraine. He had never accepted the return of Crimea to Ukrainians, never accepted stop of political prosecutions against Ukrainians in Crimea, never accepted the idea of pulling troops back from occupied Donbass. Moreover, he's currently integrating the occupied part of Donbass into Russia by providing Russian passports and the membership on Russian ruling party to the leaders of these regions, these so-called regions. So he's doing nothing to bring peace and to calm the situation down, but only because he says, I will not escalate further to the level of World War III, he gets concessions from Biden, and that is really very weak position from Biden. Now I see Ursula von der Leyen, the head of European Commission, and what she said today was much stronger than Biden. And that is actually a paradox, that very peaceful European Union, which has no army and actually no willingness to fight, is now on rhetorical level more active than the US, and that's actually a very big problem for the US.
Okay, if you want to add to that, I'm just going to take a question from one of our viewers, Masand, who says, is the US somewhat late in confronting Russian expansionism after Crimea was annexed and separatists back to home rule in the Donbass region years ago, 2014 onwards, I mean, even before that, with sanctions that were largely ineffective? Olga, your comments.
Yeah, well, I think it is, yes, it is true that some sanctions that are only discussed now, they should have been applied back in 2014. For example, the disconnection of Russia from the SWIFT payment system, or sanctions on Putin's inner circle, because these are actually the most painful measures that could have changed the situation. Unfortunately, now there is no talk about the reality pre-2014. I mean, what is being discussed now is how to prevent Putin from further aggression against Ukraine, not how to make Putin return those territories that he seized illegally from Ukraine, such as Crimea, which has been annexed illegally, and Donbass, that is currently occupied by Russians and their proxy forces. So, I think that the sanctions should have been stronger back in 2014, but it's a good thing that all these more harsh measures are being discussed. And I would actually prefer that some of these measures were also used preemptively now, not after Russia decides to launch a new invasion of Ukraine, but right now, at this moment, to deter it from launching this possible new invasion.
So, Sergej, in terms of both how the White House has behaved, or the signals that have been coming out constantly, seen both the Blinken meetings between Ukrainian officials and US officials, both in Washington and in Kyiv as well, and the continuing both economic assistance and military assistance that they say that they are giving. How do you see the situation developing now post the Biden-Putin virtual meet, Sergej?
I think that Putin clearly has seen that his tactics of blackmail works. He has got what he wanted. Like, he brought 175,000 troops and heavy equipment to the border to Ukraine, and threatened de facto to attack Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine. And we must not forget that his talking heads, like the head of Russia Today news agency Simonyan, or the head of international cooperation agency Rossotrudenchestvo Primakov, they clearly said they are ready to annex Donbass, they are ready to bomb, to shell Kyiv itself, to use cruise missiles, to use bombardments, to use aviation to destroy Ukrainian economy. That's what they were openly saying. And in order to not to do that, he has got to talk to Biden as like two world leaders. He has got concessions that Nord Stream 2 will not be stopped as long as Putin do not start a full-scale war. But we must not forget there is a full-scale war in Ukraine currently. There are dozens of Ukrainian soldiers who are being killed every month. And effectively, Putin has reached everything he wanted. He has got politically concessions from the West. He has got concessions regarding the occupied territories. No one is talking now about Donbass. Exactly as Putin, after he had occupied Crimea, he brought his army to Donbass. And after he brought his army to Donbass, everyone has forgot Crimea and said, okay, we will not talk about Crimea. Crimea is closed case. We'll talk about Donbass. So now Putin brings his 175,000 troops to the border of Ukraine, and no one is talking anymore about Donbass. Everyone is talking about, we must negotiate in order to stop Putin from attacking Kyiv itself and taking the half of Ukraine. This is very effective strategy. And I'm afraid as long as the West does not respond very actively, like installing troops in Ukraine, providing a lot of weapons to Ukraine, to make the whole idea for Putin impossible, unthinkable to attack Ukraine, because he will know he will suffer huge losses. Only this can be an effective security mechanism. Because what West now thinks, they say, okay, in order not to start a war, we need to talk. But no, Putin talks and starts a war. The only thing that prevents Putin from starting a war is an effective military resistance, which he faces. And this can be achieved not with threats of sanctions or cutting down SWIFT, although it could be helpful, but first and foremost by installing troops, by providing military security, military support to Ukraine now, and not after Putin attacks. And there will come voices in Berlin and Washington and Paris, we should not send our troops because our boys and girls will die there for Ukraine, and we are not so interested in Ukraine. We're more interested in our GDP growth.
Right. I mean, there is a comment on those lines from one of our viewers, Matara, who says, the Europeans have forgotten that in order to preserve your freedom, you should be prepared to spill some serious blood of your own soldiers instead of giving speeches and sanctions, something that's mirroring what you're saying, Sergej. But Olga, I also find it very interesting that you are a disinformation researcher. because many of the analysis was pointing towards misinformation, disinformation that was coming out from Russia, talking about provocations, whether not only from the West but from Ukraine itself, and paving the way for any military action. Could you give us a little bit more insight into that?
Yeah, and that's actually very interesting because I'm currently working on a disinformation research project with a company called Mythos Labs that has some people of Indian origin in it, and maybe our listeners in India have heard about it. And this research that I'm doing with Mythos Labs, we were analyzing disinformation on Twitter, and we actually found out that the activity of this inauthentic and accounts that are acting in coordinated manner and that are spreading pro-Russian messages has increased by 3,000% in November this year compared to the rest of 2021, which says that actually Russia not only conducts its aggression against Ukraine in the military domain, but also in this information domain. And many of these tweets that we found that were sent by these inauthentic coordinated accounts, they were in English, in French, therefore they were intended for the foreign audiences and trying to influence the public opinion of people worldwide in order to be more favorable towards Russia. And they were spreading narratives such as Ukraine is acting aggressively in Donbass, that it wants to recapture Crimea, that NATO helps Ukraine by providing weapons, and that NATO soldiers, they even said that NATO soldiers are fighting on the Ukrainian side, which is a complete nonsense. So yeah, Russia fights a war on multiple fronts, and we should be aware of that. And if I may, I just wanted to say something.
Sure.
To the Indian audience, because I know that India is the biggest democracy in the world, and we have a huge respect for the people of India. And actually, India is Ukraine's second major trading partner in Asia. So their relations with India are of utmost importance for Ukrainians. And I think Indians, as representatives of the biggest democracy in the world, they should relate to Ukraine's desire to be a democracy, and they should support Ukraine as it fights against an authoritarian regime and an authoritarian Russia that is also developing closer ties with China, India's big rival. So we really hope that India supports Ukraine in its struggle for a democratic development, and also hopefully that India in the future might support at the level of the United Nations the resolutions that condemn the occupation of Crimea. Unfortunately, it didn't happen so far. India unfortunately didn't support those resolutions that condemn the annexation of Crimea and condemn the human rights violations in Crimea. But hopefully, we are hopeful in Ukraine this is going to change in the future.
Sergej, if you want to, I know you're an Eastern Europe expert. If you want to comment on that, I'm just going to take a couple of comments or questions which are related to what Olga is saying. For example, Omkar Datpe says India is in a prickly situation. On one side, we have a special and privileged partnership with Russia, and we've just had President Putin, the only bilateral visit where he's gone to another country since the pandemic is India. And on the other hand, Ukraine, from whom we get many of our military hardware spare parts. And also Sai Prasad Vishwanathan, who says India and Ukraine bilateral, India-Russia bilateral. How does India balance the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? Something that Olga was pointing out, Sergej.
I'm unfortunately not an expert in Indian-Russian relations. So I have observed some military deals between two countries, mostly in the naval area, and there were, as far as I remember, several problems with Russian fighter planes that had been delivered to India, and then Indian customers found out that they were not exactly as they have been purchased or have been intended to be purchased. But I think that it is actually the problem of international relations overall. We have the same problem in Germany, because Russia is a very big trade partner for Germany, at least in Eastern Europe. So Russia is very small partner for Germany regarding the international scale. We have much more trade within the European Union or with the US or with China. But if we look at Eastern European countries, then Russia for sure is a bigger partner than Ukraine. Let me put it this way. And of course, there are a lot of companies which are working in Russia and don't work with Ukraine. And as soon as Russian-Ukrainian tensions come and Russia attacks and kills people in Ukraine and German government wants to sanction Ukraine, then of course these companies come to the federal chancellor and say, no, please don't do it because you will spoil our business and our business is responsible for working places and the salaries. And after all, that are our workers who will lose their job and who will not vote for you because you have helped Ukrainians who we don't care about. Very basically, cynically speaking. So I think that it is always the same problem. Like you cannot stay completely on the side of one nation, even if this nation is completely right, without spoiling your business relations with a bully state from which the income of your citizen depends. Of course, that is a huge problem. But after all, we must not forget that the basics of international security is the respect for international law. And respect for international law and non-violence and refusal to annex territories, etc. And we have experienced already the same situation in the 30s, as Germany was the enemy of Europe and started wars against Czechoslovakia and Poland and France and other nations. And before it turned to World War II, to World War, no one cared in the West, and the US continued to operate its factories of Ford car manufacturer in Germany and said, no, business relations are so important for us. We will not condemn Hitler, and he's a good guy. He takes care about his nation, etc. And that costed the world, after all, tens millions of lives. Like the World War II killed 60 million people worldwide. That was terrible. And that is because people were so afraid to be active from the very beginning and to say, okay, we shall take it into consideration. We can suffer certain economic decline, but we must stay for peace in the world. And peace in the world is what makes our lives safer. And that is what we experience now. Because as Russia is developing new nuclear weapons, they clearly show the pictures of Russian missiles bombarding Florida. That is what Vladimir Putin showed 1 year ago at his speech to the nation. Russia annexes territories. Russia kills people worldwide, in London, in Berlin. Russia sends its troops to Central Africa, where Russian mercenaries rape women, kill children, kill people, and install monuments to themselves, what they have currently did in Central African Republic. Russia exports terror and death. And that is not what we can tolerate. It's not like some small disputes about what kind of economy we should build, or should we be polite or impolite. That is what, after all, will threaten everybody. And I'm afraid if it will be like a real world conflict, then even such great nations as India will not be left aside of it.
Sure. Olga, I mean, if you have any thoughts on, there has been a lot of analysis on whether the US would have to, at some point of time, face a two-front conflict with China and Russia in terms of if Russia does anything in Ukraine and China does anything in Taiwan. Do you think the Chinese are watching and seeing what's happening on the Ukrainian-Russian border?
Absolutely, yeah. Chinese are watching very closely. They keep silent about it, as they usually do, but they are watching. And actually, what happens in Ukraine and what is the outcome of this current situation, and whether the Ukrainian democracy survives and Ukraine survives as an independent country in its current borders, this will define what will happen in other parts of the world. Of course, first of all, in Europe, because all the other Eastern European and Central European and Baltic countries are very concerned about what's happening in Ukraine, because they fear they might be next victims of the Russian aggression. But also, it will have an impact on what is going to happen in Asia, because definitely, if Ukraine fails and if it is allowed to be swallowed by Russia, by the West, then China will feel emboldened to launch an attack on Taiwan, knowing that there will be no consequences and no reaction. And in this context, again, like coming back to the issue of India and its foreign policy, I agree with the commentator who said that India's foreign policy should be guided by the national interest. Well, this is true for every country. But I think in the conditions when we see the rise of authoritarian China, and we see how Russia is strengthening its cooperation with China with every passing day, it should also be in the national interest of India to support countries such as Ukraine against Russian aggression.
Sergej, last comment on whether China is closely watching what's happening in Europe.
I'm pretty sure, and I completely agree to Olga, China is watching very precisely. And China has huge interest in Ukraine. They try to invest in Ukrainian harbors. They try to buy a Ukrainian manufacturer of helicopter motors, engines. And yeah, they have interest. And of course, they will see what will be the direction of the West. Because we have from today new government in Germany. And China will be one of the problems for this government. Because on one hand, we have this trade treaty with China as the EU. On another hand, we cannot tolerate what is happening there. And no one knows what to do because we have such a big investment in China. Our car manufacturers, our textile producers, our chip
Car manufacturers.
They have all interest in China. And of course, China looks at this and says, okay, they will not act, maybe we will try to do the same. And that is what many bad things came from this development. As Ukraine gave up its nuclear warheads and then had been attacked, I think many nations will say, okay, we will not give up our nuclear weapons anymore because we have seen what has happened to Ukraine. The same will happen if Russia attacks Ukraine and will not get unpunished. Many nations will say, okay, Putin did it. Why don't we do it? We should withdraw the borders. That will be a very bad example for the world.
Sergej Sumlenny, expert on Eastern Europe. Thank you so much for appearing on StratNews Global. We hope to see you much more often and have a good day.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
And Olga Tokariuk from Kyiv, we will keep coming back to you because this situation is not going anywhere very soon. Thank you for your time and your experience as well.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to interact with your audience.
In fact, your audience also says thank you to both the speakers, Sai Prasad there. Thanks, Olga and Sergej. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you have already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do help spread the word among those who haven't noticed us. And if you're a new viewer, do check out all our work on both our website and our YouTube channel. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.